Welcome to Neighbors Recounted, the place where real stories from the shadows of everyday life come to light. Tonight, we dive deep into the desert, where solitude turns into suspense, and the line between reality and fear blurs. Before we begin, make sure you hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a chilling tale. And if this story rattles you, share your thoughts in the comments. Did you feel it too? The footsteps circling your mind. Now step inside the VW, lock the doors, and listen closely. This is the story of one terrifying night at Red Rock Canyon, Nevada. The desert air was unusually still that night, heavy and thick like it was holding its breath, waiting for something I couldn't yet name. I remember stepping out of my Volkswagen camper, the faint scrape of gravel under my boots sounding louder than it should have, echoing against the rocks as if the canyon itself had tuned into every small sound. My name's Marcus, I'm 42, and I've spent more nights in RVs than I can count, though I never expected Red Rock Canyon, Nevada to teach me what real fear felt like. I had parked at a small, barely marked campground not far from the main trailhead. It was late July, the desert sun still clinging stubbornly to the horizon, dying slowly into crimson shadows. The canyon walls glowed like molten stone in the last light, and I felt that familiar thrill of being swallowed by the vastness of the desert, alone yet so visible against the open sky. My plans were simple: a few nights under the stars, a little solitude, maybe a hike or two. I wasn't expecting that solitude to fight back. The first signs were subtle. I noticed the way the wind carried noises, stretching them, twisting them. Rocks falling in the distance sounded like whispers, and my own footsteps on the packed dirt sounded like someone following. I chalked it up to imagination, as I always do, because telling yourself it's nothing is easier than admitting fear. But there's a point when the rational mind stops and instinct takes over. For me, that moment came just after sunset when I had finished setting up the camper and stepped outside for one last stretch. It was the first of those footsteps, soft, deliberate, and measured. I froze instantly, straining to hear. My heart jumped, a drum inside my chest that felt too loud for the emptiness around me. I was alone, or at least I thought I was. I called out, "Hello?" My voice sounded small, absurdly fragile, lost in the canyon. The footsteps didn't respond. I tried to rationalize, telling myself someone else was just another camper, maybe setting up late. But the campsite was mostly empty, and the nearest human presence was probably a mile away. That's when I noticed it. The footsteps weren't moving forward, they were circling. Just faintly at first, like a cat padding around the edge of a fire, testing, waiting. The air grew cooler, unnaturally so. I could feel the desert heat draining from my skin as a silence thicker than the canyon walls pressed in. My palms started to sweat. I went back inside the VW, locking the door, but I didn't turn on the lights. I wanted to see without being seen, to witness without giving away my presence. The footsteps slowed, then paused. There was a scrape, a subtle shift in the dirt outside. And then, nothing. I tried to sleep, lying on the narrow bed in the back of the camper, listening to the desert at night. The stars were bright, distant, and indifferent, but the earth beneath them seemed alive, moving in ways I couldn't predict. Every so often, the silence was broken by that soft circling, the unmistakable rhythm of someone or something skirting around my vehicle. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a coyote. But animals don't walk with the kind of careful deliberation I heard. They don't circle like a predator studying its prey. By midnight, I was trembling, wrapped in a thin blanket, gripping a flashlight like a lifeline. I wanted to peek out, to prove to myself that I wasn't alone, but the idea of opening that door felt like betrayal, like stepping into a trap that had been waiting all along. The circling grew more deliberate, more confident. I could hear it. The scrape of boots or claws on gravel, the faint crunch of dirt underfoot. It was close enough now that my breath caught in my throat every time it shifted around the camper. And then I heard the voice, or something that sounded like it. A whisper, impossibly faint, carried through the open window. Just a syllable. Marcus. My blood froze. I hadn't told anyone my name on this trip. I hadn't spoken it aloud tonight. I sat frozen, unable to move, the flashlight trembling in my hands. The whisper came again, this time a little louder, more insistent. Marcus. I don't know if I can describe the feeling of being hunted by a presence you cannot see. It wasn't fear in the usual sense. Fear is manageable. It has rules. This was something else, an internal panic that burrowed into your thoughts, making you doubt everything, your senses, your sanity, your own instincts. I wanted to convince myself I was imagining it, but the evidence was all around me. Footsteps circling, stopping, whispering, retreating just out of sight. I realized, in that moment, that the canyon itself had become my enemy. The rocks pressed in, shadows twisting unnaturally, carrying sounds in ways that played with my perception. I felt as though I were in a living maze, where every corner of the RV, every small space of the campground was being watched, tested. I was trapped in a bubble of paranoia that I couldn't escape. Hours passed, or maybe minutes, time lost all meaning. Every creak of the camper's frame, every gust of wind set my nerves on edge. I wanted to call for help, but cell service was non-existent. Even if I had reached someone, what could I have said? That I was being stalked by invisible footsteps at midnight in the desert? It sounded insane. And in that emptiness, in that silence that wasn't really silent, I understood. I was utterly, terrifyingly alone. The breakthrough came not with courage, but with necessity. I knew that staying hidden inside the camper was no longer an option. Whatever was outside would wait, circling, testing, probing. I had to move. Slowly, deliberately, I unlatched the door, peeking through the small window first. The desert was empty, or appeared to be. The flashlight cut through darkness, revealing nothing beyond the faint outline of the canyon walls. I stepped out, trying to keep my voice calm, measured. "I know you're there," I said, more to convince myself than anyone else. The air was dry, whispering against my skin, carrying my words away before they could settle. And then I heard it again, soft, almost playful. Footsteps. They had resumed, slower this time, circling, but no longer hidden. I grabbed a long branch, feeling the solid weight as my only weapon, and moved cautiously around the camper. The footsteps followed, echoing on the rocks, never approaching, never retreating. It became a perverse dance, predator and prey, intertwined in a rhythm I couldn't break. My mind screamed to run, to lock the doors, to hide, but my body obeyed instinct. I kept circling, keeping the camper between us, daring the unseen to make a move. Minutes or hours later, a faint breeze stirred the canyon floor, shifting the sand, carrying with it a scent, smoke, faint and acrid like something smoldering. My stomach tightened. I realized then that I had underestimated the desert, the night, the unknown. The footsteps were a warning, a test, and I had passed it simply by surviving it, by staying awake, alert, and aware. Finally, as dawn began to stretch pale fingers across the sky, the footsteps stopped. Silence returned, heavier, more oppressive than before. I didn't sleep again that night, sitting by the open door of the VW, flashlight in hand, eyes straining against the growing light. When the first hiker passed the main trailhead, I forced myself to smile, to speak, to appear normal. But I knew that whatever had circled me in the night hadn't left, only retreated. By the time I packed up, my hands still shaking, I understood something essential about camping in places like Red Rock Canyon. The wilderness isn't just a backdrop for adventure. It's alive, unpredictable, and capable of teaching lessons in fear and survival. I learned that night to trust my instincts, to respect silence, to honor the spaces between sound and shadow. And I learned that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's acknowledging it, facing it, and moving forward anyway. Even now, months later, I think back to that night, to the sound of footsteps circling my camper at midnight. It haunts me, not in nightmares alone, but in quiet moments when the wind shifts just right and the world feels too still. It's a reminder that fear is both teacher and companion, that solitude can be as threatening as any predator, and that some lessons in life are earned only in the darkness. And for anyone considering an RV trip in the wilds of Nevada or anywhere else, remember this: the land remembers, the wind listens, And sometimes when the world is asleep, it walks quietly in circles, waiting to see if you notice. I never imagined that a simple trip to Glacier National Park would leave a shadow on my mind that refused to lift. My name is Marcus, I'm 34, and for years, my partner Elise and I have chased the quiet corners of America in our battered Volkswagen camper. We've slept under countless stars, heard the wind hum through pine forests, and learned that the open road is both liberating and humbling. But what happened that September night in Montana was something entirely different, something that stretched the thin veil of safety we often take for granted when we park in the solitude of nature. We had arrived at Glacier mid-afternoon, the sky painted with those brilliant late summer blues that Montana is famous for. The park was already whispering its charm, the jagged peaks dusted with the season's first frost, sunlight sliding along glacial rivers like molten silver. Our campsite was tucked away near Avalanche Lake, off a narrow, winding road that smelled of damp earth and pine needles. Few others had claimed the area, and we liked it that way. Solitude is what we chase, not crowds. The setup of our camper was routine. Elise deftly unrolled our tent awning. I started a small fire pit, and the smell of pine smoke began to mix with the tang of the lake air. Everything seemed normal, almost painfully serene. But I remember an almost imperceptible shift in the wind that day, a sense of something slipping just beyond the edge of vision. The kind of feeling you dismiss at first because you're tired from travel, or maybe because you're not quite ready to acknowledge fear. That evening, after a modest dinner of canned beans and coffee brewed over the fire, we decided to take a short walk along the lakeshore. The sky had started to deepen into indigo, and stars began to prick through the velvet canopy above. The water of Avalanche Lake mirrored the night, black and still, broken only by the occasional ripple of a fish or an unseen breeze. That's when I first noticed the lights, small, distant, darting between the trees on the far side of the lake. At first, I tried to rationalize them, perhaps campers in the other part of the park, or hikers with headlamps making their way to a campsite, but the way they moved was wrong. They didn't follow trails. They didn't stay together. Instead, they flitted between trunks and over underbrush in ways that suggested intention, but not human logic. I froze, feeling a cold coil of apprehension tighten in my stomach. I could almost hear Elise's voice in my mind, warning me not to overthink, but the instinct to be vigilant had already taken root. "Elise, do you see that?" I whispered, pointing toward the forest. She squinted, adjusting her scarf against the chill. Maybe it's just other campers," she said, though her voice carried a thread of uncertainty that mirrored my own. I nodded, forcing a laugh that didn't quite land. But even as I spoke, my mind raced. Our VW camper sat several hundred yards back, glowing faintly in the firelight we'd left burning. It was a distance we could manage if needed, yet the thought of retreating didn't comfort me. Instead, it made my heart thrum faster. Retreat would mean leaving this stretch of forest, leaving something unknown moving behind the trees, unchallenged. We decided to return to camp. Our footsteps crunched against the frozen pine needles, echoing unnaturally in the heavy silence. The lights didn't disappear. They mirrored us, gliding between trees ahead, sometimes stopping, sometimes vanishing, only to appear again a few dozen feet further on. I kept telling myself that it was some sort of animal, perhaps a deer caught in a glint of firelight, but the rhythm didn't match natural movement. It was deliberate, almost calculated. Back at the camper, we bolted the doors, though I knew that wasn't much of a barrier. The lights came closer after a while, though I couldn't see them directly, only the movement behind the tree line, shadows elongating and shrinking as the moonlight broke through the canopy. The fear was slow, creeping like a frost spreading across the glass of a window. We didn't speak, not because we were silent by choice, but because our voices seemed too loud, too permanent, too vulnerable. Hours passed. At some point, the fire burned down to embers, leaving us in the half-light of the moon. That's when the first sound came, a repeated knocking, low and resonant, against the side of the camper. Not wind, not tree branches, something deliberate. I gripped a flashlight like a talisman, shining its beam toward the noise. The forest beyond our sight stretched into shadows, and the light barely pierced the gloom. Still, I could see something, an outline, crouched low, moving with unnatural grace between the pines. I whispered Elise's name. Her hand found mine, cold and trembling. Our eyes met, and in that silent exchange, we acknowledged the terror we were both trying to deny. It wasn't a prank, it wasn't a story, it wasn't the product of imagination alone. Something was there just beyond reach, watching, waiting, considering. The knocking resumed, faster this time, then stopped. Then the lights moved closer, suddenly stopping just beyond the tree line. I could hear the snap of small branches, the rush of wind over leaves, but there was a rhythm to it, like breathing, like patience stretched to breaking. My body tensed. Every instinct screamed to flee, but every story I had ever read about people running blindly into a forest flashed through my mind. We needed a plan. Elise squeezed my hand and I whispered a direction. We wait, we watch. We only move if we have to. Minutes, or maybe hours passed. Time had become meaningless, suspended in fear. Then a voice, low, almost a hiss, carried by the wind but distinctly human. Go, it said. Or maybe it was a warning, a suggestion, I couldn't tell. The voice seemed to come from all around us, echoing from the trunks and rocks. My stomach churned. We were outnumbered. We were exposed. Yet something inside me urged calm, urged strategy. Panic would not save us. The first tangible threat came in the form of movement right outside the camper's window, something heavy, deliberate, scraping across the metal of our vehicle. My breath hitched. The lights reflected in the windows, closer now, swaying, weaving between trees like living lanterns. Then came the growl, low and guttural, unmistakably real. My mind scrambled through possibilities. Bear, wolf, human, something else entirely. The forest had become both predator and accomplice, pressuring us from every side. Elise and I made our move simultaneously. One step forward, one pull of a hand, and we were sprinting toward the backup plan, the secondary exit in the rear of the camper. The lights darted following, but the forest seemed almost to shield us in patches, the thick pines a fragmented barrier between us and whatever pursued. Adrenaline sharpened every sense. The smell of damp earth, the crack of broken twigs underfoot, the slap of my own heartbeat against my ribs. Fear was a tangible companion, pressing at my shoulders, whispering in my ear that every step might be our last. By the time we reached the small clearing near the edge of the lake, the forest seemed to recoil slightly, as though it too were aware of what was happening. The lights did not follow into open space. They hesitated as if respecting an invisible boundary. We didn't stop running until our lungs burned, until the camper was behind us, until the immediate threat had vanished into the shadows. And yet even then, the fear lingered, rooted deep. We could not shake the sensation of being watched, of unseen eyes tracking our retreat. The lake lay calm again, reflecting moonlight that felt almost accusing, almost aware. We collapsed at the edge of the clearing, shivering, breathless, haunted. What had followed us? And why had it stopped where it did? In that silence, we learned our first lesson. The forest is not merely a backdrop for adventure. It is a living entity, one that observes, reacts, and remembers. And sometimes when the boundaries of safety are crossed, the forest chooses to remind you of its power. We didn't speak for a long while, lying there at the edge of the clearing, listening to the lake's soft lapping against the shore. The night was deceptively calm, as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for something else to happen. Eventually, I turned to Elise, her face pale and drawn in the moonlight, eyes wide with lingering terror. "We need to move," I whispered. Not because the danger was immediate, but because staying meant surrendering to the unknown, letting it dictate our every breath. She nodded, silent, and we began the slow trek back toward the camper. Every footstep felt wrong, every crack of a branch under our shoes sounding far too loud in the tension-soaked forest. The lights were gone, or at least we could no longer see them, but the sensation of being hunted clung to us like fog. The path back was deceptive. Trails that had seemed familiar in daylight were distorted under moonlight. Roots jutted out like skeletal hands, rocks loomed as hidden traps, and the dense pines seemed to lean inward, enclosing us in a cage we hadn't noticed before. I felt the weight of the forest pressing from all sides, a presence that was patient, watchful, intelligent. Somewhere deep in the trees, I could swear I heard movement, soft, deliberate, almost rhythmic. Reaching the camper, we immediately checked the locks. The side door had faint scratch marks, shallow but deliberate, like something had tried to pry it open without making a sound. My hands trembled as I traced the scratches. Elise's fingers brushed mine, and we shared a look heavy with unsaid fear. "We have to call someone," she said, her voice steady despite the quiver I heard beneath it. But our phones, reliable all summer on the road, had no signal here. Of course they didn't. Out here, in the heart of Glacier, we were alone. Completely alone. We decided to wait until first light, reasoning that whatever was out there was less likely to linger in daylight. We barricaded the camper as best we could, wedging chairs against doors, piling our gear near the windows. Every shadow became suspect. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves made my stomach knot with dread. I realized, almost too late, that fear had become its own entity inside me, an unshakable awareness that the forest had noticed us, had marked us, and was willing to test our resolve. Sleep came in fits, broken by dreams that mimicked the night's events. In one, the lights danced just beyond our window, coalescing into human shapes that whispered secrets I could not comprehend. In another, I saw the camper suspended in darkness, floating over the lake while shadowed figures reached up, silent and patient. Each time I woke, heart hammering, I saw Elise beside me, equally restless, equally haunted. By early morning, the sky had shifted from ink to steel, clouds tinged with the promise of frost. We made a silent decision to leave the campsite, knowing that lingering only increased risk. Our Volkswagen, normally a vessel of freedom, now felt like a fragile shield against the unknown. We packed quickly, the efficiency of our hands contrasting sharply with the unease in our minds. Every step toward the vehicle felt like a gamble, every glance over our shoulders carrying the weight of unseen eyes. When we finally climbed into the camper and started the engine, relief came, but it was hollow. The forest seemed to release us grudgingly, the trees parting as if granting permission to leave. I glanced in the rearview mirror. The clearing and the tree line receded, but in the shadows just beyond, I thought I saw movement, shapes merging with the forest, watching, waiting. We drove in silence, the engine's hum a fragile comfort against the memory of the night. But the terror didn't dissipate. Over the next few days, as we moved through the park, traces of what we'd encountered lingered in subtle ways. A branch bent unnaturally, a footprint too large to be a deer's, the faint glimmer of lights at dusk that vanished whenever we tried to approach. Each time, my body remembered the panic. My mind relived the instinctive terror that had coursed through me in the night. Elise was quieter than usual, and in her silence, I realized she was processing her own fears. There was no talking it away. No rationalizing what had happened. The forest had a memory, and we had become part of it. That knowledge was heavier than any physical threat because it reminded us of our vulnerability. Our trip continued, but the dynamic had shifted. We kept the camper close to main roads, camped near other travelers when possible, and avoided trails that carried too many shadows. Every night, though, I felt that quiet unease, like the forest was breathing along with us, like it remembered our trespass and was cataloging our fear. It was impossible to separate the memory of the lights from the visceral sense of threat, a lesson in the subtlety and relentlessness of the wild. One afternoon, while hiking near Logan Pass, I paused to watch a group of hikers navigating a narrow ridge. The wind swept across the mountains sharp and cold, carrying a smell of wet stone and pine. It struck me how fragile our sense of control is. Out here, the mountains are indifferent to our presence, our routines, our confidence. We can plan, prepare, and strategize, but the wilderness has its own rhythm, one that can turn awe into fear in a heartbeat. I thought of Avalanche Lake, the lights weaving between the pines, and the growl that had frozen me in place. That fear was no longer just memory. It was a warning, a visceral understanding of boundaries and respect. The forest taught me something else as well. Fear is not weakness. It is attention, awareness, and the pulse of life itself. That night, in the black of Glacier National Park, fear had been our ally, our guide, our sentinel. It forced us to move carefully, to notice the signs others might dismiss. It kept us alive. But it also left its mark, a subtle haunting that whispered whenever we were alone, that lingered in shadows, and that reminded us that nature in all its grandeur can be terrifying in ways that defy explanation. By the time we left Glacier, the park had returned to its serene, majestic self, or so it seemed. The mountains glistened in the morning sun, rivers sparkled, and wildlife moved along trails without concern for our presence. But for Elise and me, the experience was indelible. The forest had not just shown us beauty. It had shown us its other face, the one that watches, waits, and tests the limits of our courage. Months later, when we shared the story with friends who also travel in RVs, I noticed the same pattern. Disbelief at first, then unease creeping into their expressions. No one wants to admit that the wild can feel conscious, that the dark can contain something deliberate. But we had seen it, we had felt it, and for all our love of freedom, adventure, and the open road, we had learned that the wilderness carries memory, intention, and the capacity to remind us, sharply and suddenly, that we are not always the masters of the terrain we traverse. The lessons from Glacier remain with us. Always check the perimeters. Never assume that solitude guarantees safety. Trust instincts, even when they whisper in quiet, irrational ways. And above all, understand that fear is not merely emotion. It is a guide, a teacher, and sometimes a protector. When I close my eyes now and think of Avalanche Lake, I do not see just the water or the trees. I see the lights moving in the forest, the deliberate, impossible movements, the shadows pressing against our camper. I feel the adrenaline, the shiver of the unknown brushing against our senses. I remember that night as a lesson etched deep into memory. The wild is alive and it never forgets. Even in daylight, months later, I can feel the faint echo of those lights, a reminder that some encounters are never truly left behind. The forest waits, it remembers, and we, Marcus and Elise, will always carry that memory, both a burden and a gift, as we continue to chase the road, the sky, and the fragile, terrifying beauty of the world beyond our camper's walls. The RV's slide-out shook. Not the subtle, mechanical vibration you expect when the wind brushes past a parked trailer. This was deliberate. It rattled with a slow, almost accusatory rhythm, as if something, or someone, was testing the walls of my own private space. I had been lying awake, staring at the ceiling, the low hum of the night settling like a suffocating blanket over Big Sur's forested cliffs. The fog rolled in thick along the coastline, muffling the world outside, and the smell of wet pine pressed against the window glass. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, a mechanical hiccup, the RV settling, but the sound repeated, sharper this time, the metal groaning like a warning. My name is Ethan. I'm 34, and I've been RV camping all over the West Coast for nearly a decade. I know the quirks of these machines, the way tires expand in heat, the subtle tremors of suspension. I know that the wilderness is indifferent to our presence, that the ocean winds can rattle even the heaviest trailer. But this, whatever this was, felt intentional. There was a rhythm to it, deliberate enough to make the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. I rolled over, pulling the blanket tighter around myself, telling myself I'd laugh about this in the morning. But laughter was impossible when the slide-out thudded again, a sound that didn't belong to physics or engineering. It belonged to something else. The campground was quiet. Too quiet. Most sites were empty, except for a few distant rigs whose owners had already disappeared into their own dreams. A few lights flickered here and there, but the mist swallowed everything else, turning even the familiar shapes of trees and rocks into monstrous silhouettes. My rig felt isolated, perched precariously on the edge of the cliffside, like it could tip into the abyss at any second. And yet the shaking continued, the slide-out shivering under some invisible weight. I sat up, the wood floor cold beneath my palms, and my breath quickened. I wasn't afraid of the dark. I was afraid of what I couldn't see in it. I got up, shaking off the initial wave of panic that had licked at my chest, and walked slowly to the controls. Maybe the slide-out wasn't fully retracted. Maybe the locks had slipped. Rational explanations, familiar, safe, comforting, were all I had. My fingers trembled as I pressed the button to retract it fully. The motor whirred, struggling for a moment before giving in. The shaking stopped. Silence returned, dense and unnatural, broken only by the occasional call of a distant bird or the whisper of wind in the trees. Relief should have followed, but it didn't. Relief was impossible when my mind had already been alerted to the possibility that the world inside my RV had changed in some imperceptible way. I returned to bed, pulling the blanket over my head as if the fabric could shield me from whatever was out there. But sleep didn't come. Every creak of the trailer, every whisper of the fogged-up windows sounded amplified. I tried to anchor myself to facts. There was no one here, no signs of intrusion, but my body refused logic. My eyes darted toward the window, toward the darkness that pressed against the glass like wet hands. Shadows moved in the fog, or perhaps my imagination conjured them, and I couldn't tell which was worse, the truth or the possibility of it. Hours passed, I don't know how long. Time in these moments is a fluid thing, stretched thin by fear. At some point, the shaking returned, but softer this time, almost hesitant, like a prelude. I froze, holding my breath, counting each thump. Then I realized the sound wasn't coming from the slide-out. It was coming from inside the RV, a subtle scraping thud that seemed to echo along the walls. I thought of every story I'd ever heard about campers being stalked, about noises that couldn't be explained. My heart pounded, every beat a hammer against my ribs, a frantic insistence that I move, that I escape, but my legs refused to respond. I was trapped in the center of my own fear, aware that every step I took could lead me into something worse than the unknown. I grabbed a flashlight from the counter, the weight of it familiar in my hands, grounding me in the world of touch, sound, and light. I clicked it on, the beam slicing through the darkness, revealing the familiar contours of the RV's interior, the kitchenette, the small couch, the edge of the bed. Nothing had moved. But the scraping sound persisted, subtle, almost shy, like something testing its own presence against mine. I moved slowly toward the source, my bare feet making soft contact with the cold floor. I reached the rear corner near the storage compartment, and the sound stopped. The silence that replaced it was heavier, pressing against my ears, filling the space like water filling a vessel. Then I saw it. The slide-out. The one I had already secured hours ago. The latch hadn't budged, the motor hadn't moved, but the edge of the panel now protruded slightly, just enough for a shadow to leak out. I backed away slowly, telling myself it was a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the flashlight bouncing off the walls. But deep down, I knew the truth. I had spent enough nights in enough strange campgrounds to recognize fear when it wasn't lying to me. I wasn't imagining it. Something had moved that shouldn't have. Something had been inside while I thought I was alone. I didn't run. I couldn't. Not yet. I needed to understand, to rationalize, to force a plausible explanation before the panic claimed me entirely. I crouched, shining the light under the edge of the slide-out. Nothing. Just the small storage gap, dark and empty, the metal walls unyielding. My rational mind whispered reassurances, mechanical, natural, explainable. My instinct screamed, "This isn't natural." I felt the hair on my arms rise, the chill crawling up my spine, and I realized with a sinking horror that the real fear wasn't the shaking, the scraping, or the shadow. It was the thought that I had been sharing this RV with something I couldn't name, and that it had been patient, waiting. I sat back on the edge of the bed, flashlight still in hand, my back pressed against the wall. The silence stretched, thickening, as if the trailer itself had grown aware of my presence and was holding its breath. Then I heard it, whispered, the softest possible whisper, but unmistakable, coming from the storage area. My name. Ethan. Just my name, drawn out slowly, deliberately. I frozen in a tableau of disbelief and terror. No one should have known I was here. The campground was empty. The RV was locked. Yet there it was, my own name spoken in the darkness, and something in me recognized that voice didn't belong to the living. For the first time that night, I felt a primal urge to flee, to escape, to abandon logic and hope that the night would not claim me. But I also knew, some instinct buried deep from years on the road, that movement could be worse. It could draw attention, awaken curiosity, provoke interaction. I stayed still, my eyes fixed on the shadow at the edge of the slide out, my ears straining for the next whisper. It didn't come. Only the fog, the distant waves crashing against the cliffs, and the soft, imperceptible creak of the RV adjusting to its own weight. I stayed that way until the first hint of dawn lightened the horizon, the fog turning silver, and the sense of menace ebbed just enough to let my heart slow. I checked the slide out again, meticulously, top to bottom, locks engaged, latch secure, nothing out of place. Yet the memory lingered, the whisper, the deliberate shaking, the weightless presence that had occupied my RV. I packed slowly that morning, deliberately, methodically, aware that every sound could be the precursor to another encounter. When I finally drove away, the cliffs receding behind me, I realized the lesson I had learned. Fear doesn't always announce itself. It waits, patient, intimate, and often resides in the very spaces you think you know best. Even now, months later, I remember the shaking. I remember the whisper. And I remember that night at Big Sur, when my own RV became a vessel for a fear I could neither fully understand nor ever forget. I never thought a place as peaceful as Cades Cove could feel like a trap. My name is Marcus, I'm 34, and I've been RV camping all over the Smokies for nearly a decade. I tell people I love the solitude, the quiet mornings, the way the mist hovers over the trees like it's holding its breath. But what I learned that August night is something I'll carry for the rest of my life. Something that makes every shadow feel sharper, every whisper of wind suspect. I pulled into the campground just as the sun was dipping behind the ridge, painting the valley in molten gold. My Volkswagen van was packed for a week, and the familiar weight of my gear settling around me like an old friend. The campground was empty, nearly abandoned, except for a few scattered rigs tucked among the trees. I remember thinking how lucky I was to snag one of the better spots, right near the tree line where the forest pressed close. That closeness had always been comforting. Until it wasn't. Setting up my small camp, I noticed the quiet first. Not the kind of quiet that fills you with peace, but the kind that presses against your eardrums, waiting. Even the birds seemed absent, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and the faint, sweet rot of fallen leaves. I chalked it up to the late hour. I told myself it was just Cades Cove settling into evening, that the night sounds would come, gentle and familiar. I started a small fire, the way I always did, watching sparks drift upward into the darkening sky. I sipped from a can of beer and let the hum of the van settle me. That's when I first felt it, a shift in the air, a subtle tightening at the base of my skull, as if someone had entered my peripheral vision but refused to step fully into the light. I froze, looking around the tree line, half expecting to see a fellow camper wandering too close. There was nothing, just trees and shadows. I laughed quietly, shaking my head. I've always been sensitive to the forest. I hear things most people don't, the small snap of a twig, the soft scuffle of an animal. But this wasn't a squirrel or a deer. It was deliberate. A pause, then a shift in the darkness. I told myself it was nothing, a trick of my mind, but the feeling didn't leave. It coiled around my spine and refused to release me. By the time the fire had burned down to glowing embers, the last remnants of sunlight had vanished, leaving a dim, bluish twilight that blurred the edges of the trees. I stood up, intending to stretch my legs, and that's when I noticed it. Just at the edge of the clearing, the tree line rippled. At first, I thought it was the wind. I told myself the branches were moving, that the forest itself was breathing. But my stomach dropped when the movement didn't match the rhythm of the breeze. It was fluid, intentional. I froze, every nerve screaming, but I couldn't look away. And then I saw it, a figure. I swear it was human-shaped, standing just beyond the reach of the firelight, the darkness draping over it like a cloak. I could feel its gaze, not across my eyes, but pressing directly into my chest, heavy and accusing. My heart hammered against my ribs, and my mind raced for an explanation. A camper? A hiker? But why stay there, still as a shadow, watching? The rational part of me knew I should just call out, maybe shine my flashlight, but something primal froze my tongue. The figure didn't move again, not a step. And yet I felt it shift, inch closer. Or maybe it was me, my mind tricking me as I stepped back without realizing. I could hear my own breathing, ragged, loud, filling the empty valley like an alarm. The air grew colder, even though the day had been warm, and I realized I hadn't felt the temperature drop before. That chill made every hair on my arms stand on end, and a low, unnameable dread settled into my chest. I reached for my phone, intending to call the ranger or a nearby friend, but the moment I touched it, a twig snapped from somewhere deep in the tree line. Not close, not far, somewhere exactly where that figure had been standing. My pulse spiked. I could feel my hands trembling as I gripped the phone like a lifeline. The figure didn't retreat. It didn't move closer. It just watched. My mind ran through every possible rational explanation. Maybe someone was lost, maybe it was a prankster, but every logical thought in a tide of fear. I was alone, isolated, and completely exposed. The forest around me, the same place I had loved for years, now felt like it had turned against me, the trees looming like silent sentinels holding back some unspeakable secret. I tried to shake it off, forcing myself to focus on the fire, the glowing embers, the smell of burning pine. I told myself that the figure would leave that night. Hikers always moved on, but the movement in the trees, the subtle sway, the hint of a silhouette kept me frozen. Every instinct screamed at me to retreat, to lock the van doors, to drive away, yet my curiosity anchored me in place, mingling dread with an inexplicable need to see, and then something else. A soft, deliberate step from the edge of the clearing. Not a stumble, not a random crack of a branch, but a step that matched the rhythm of a human walking silently. My throat went dry. My pulse was deafening in my ears. I couldn't see it clearly now, just a dark smear among the shadows, but I knew somebody or something was there, and it wasn't friendly. I stumbled back toward the van, heart hammering, adrenaline lacing every fiber of my body. As I reached the edge of the firelight, the figure disappeared. Not into the trees, not behind a bush, just gone. My logical mind rebelled. No human could vanish that fast. Yet the proof, or the proof of fear, was undeniable. The pressure of those eyes, the way the air had vibrated around me, the whisper of movement where there should have been none. I slammed the van door shut, locked it, and leaned against the cold metal, chest heaving, sweat chilling in the night air. I could hear nothing except the faint crackle of my dying fire and the soft, restless whisper of the wind through the treetops, but I knew it hadn't left. Whatever it was still out there, hiding, watching, waiting. And that's when panic truly hit, the kind that doesn't scream but curls around your spine and squeezes, that quiet, unyielding terror that tells you with absolute certainty that if you move the wrong way, make the wrong noise, step the wrong foot, something will notice, something will act. I fumbled for my keys, my flashlight, anything I could use. I didn't care anymore about the beauty of the cove, about solitude, about the serenity I'd come here to chase. There was only survival. My fingers shook as I clicked the flashlight on, sweeping the beam across the tree line. Empty. No figure. No sign of human presence at all. And yet my instinct screamed at me. It was still there, watching, waiting. I pressed my back against the van, like feeling every shadow stretch and twist under the moonlight that had begun to spill across the clearing. Every rustle of leaves made me flinch. Every distant call of a nocturnal bird sounded too precise, too deliberate, as if it were signaling, communicating something I didn't want to understand. I couldn't stay here, but where would I go? Out into the dark, through unknown paths, with some unseen watcher between me and the safety of the main road? Or sit here, trapped in the firelight, pretending the forest was still my friend? I realized then that whatever had come out of the tree line had changed the entire landscape of my mind. Every familiar pattern of thought, every routine I had built around my camping trips felt shattered. Fear wasn't a visitor. It was the only inhabitant now, and it would not leave until I understood its rules. I had to make a decision, and it had to be immediate. I could feel the figure, the weight of unseen eyes pressing into me from the darkness just beyond the light. And I knew, as much as I feared the forest, that hesitation could be fatal. The first major panic had arrived, a tidal wave of dread crashing over my nerves, my body, my mind. My sanctuary, the quiet, beloved solitude of the Smokies, had become a gauntlet, and I had no idea who or what was waiting for me beyond the trees. I swallowed hard and forced myself to move, though every step felt like walking through molasses. The flashlight trembled in my hand, casting jittering beams across the undergrowth, illuminating nothing but twisted roots and the occasional glint of wet leaves. I told myself to stay calm, that this was just some prankster, maybe a camper lost in the dark, but even as I said it, I felt the lie in my own words. There was no mischief here, no playful human mistake. This presence was deliberate, calculated. I inched around the edge of the clearing, hugging the van like a lifeline. My eyes darted from shadow to shadow, scanning every shape, every movement that might betray a hidden figure. And then I heard it, a whisper, low, almost inaudible, but unmistakable. It was human, guttural, and it came from just beyond the tree line, moving parallel to me. I froze. The sound wasn't directed at me yet, not like a threat, but it was there, a soft and steady reminder that I wasn't alone. My heart pounded so violently that I could feel it in my throat. I gripped the flashlight tighter, the knuckles of my white hands turning rigid. My breaths were shallow, each one a struggle against the panic that now clawed at my chest like a living thing. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs felt glued to the earth. I couldn't tell if freezing would save me or make me a target. My mind spun in circles, caught between fight and flight, caught between reason and instinct. Then it stepped forward. Just a small motion, a ripple of shadow among the trees. My flashlight caught the edge of its sleeve, or maybe it was the bark catching light. Either way, my stomach turned, and my body tensed as if anticipating impact. The forest seemed to lean closer, closing in, every sound amplified. The crunch of leaves under a foot, the whisper of wind against bark, the distant hoot of an owl that sounded suddenly sinister. I could almost feel the figure's eyes boring into me, a pressure that twisted my insides like a coil spring. I realized with a jolt that I had no control here. Every instinct screamed to retreat, but I couldn't see an escape route without exposing myself to the shadow. I was trapped in a triangle of firelight, van, and darkness, and the darkness had begun to take shape, to assert its own authority. I remembered every story I'd ever heard about the Smokies. Strangers, campers who disappeared, hikers who vanished into the night, but I'd always dismissed them as folklore. Tonight, folklore was breathing, waiting just beyond the tree line. I decided to step backward, inch by inch, toward the van, praying I wouldn't stumble over a root or make a sound that might draw attention. My mind raced with worst-case scenarios. Someone could jump out, could grab me, no. I didn't want to think that far. But the rational part of me, the part still clinging to logic, argued, maybe it's watching, sure, but it's waiting for me to make a mistake. And maybe I had just made the first one. Another step, another whisper. The voice was softer now, almost a sigh, as if it were speaking to the trees themselves, or murmuring in rhythm with the night. I couldn't discern words, my mind refused to let me focus, but the intent was clear. Someone was out there. someone was human. And whatever game this was, I was the prey. I reached the van and fumbled with the door, fingers slippery with sweat. The moment my hand brushed the handle, there it was again, a movement in the corner of my eye just beyond the firelight. I swung the flashlight, heart leaping into my throat, and caught it. The shadow of a person ducking behind a tree, just for a second, long enough for my mind to register the impossible speed. There was no rustling of leaves, no cracking of branches, just a ghostly disappearance that made me question my own senses. Panic surged. My body screamed for action. I wanted to slam the door, start the engine, drive into the dark, and pray I could escape. But even as I did, a deeper fear rooted me in place. If I ran blindly, I could end up in the forest, away from the road, and the figure could follow, could intercept. My rational mind knew I was in danger, yet my fear of exposure kept me trapped in the open. The forest was both enemy and accomplice, hiding the watcher, amplifying every shadow, every subtle shift in the night. I thought about calling for help again, but my phone in my pocket felt suddenly useless. The reception out here was spotty, unreliable, and I couldn't risk moving too far to find a signal. The figure could be anywhere now, weaving through the trees, following the edge of the clearing, just out of sight. Every instinct screamed that I had to move, to leave. But the moment I tried to lift myself from the van, the softest crunch echoed from the shadows. Footsteps, carefully measured, right outside the firelight. My stomach dropped. My limbs went rigid. I was caught in a standoff I couldn't negotiate, a silent duel of observation and anticipation. I could hear my own heart in the stillness, feel the sweat sliding down my back, smell the dampness of the soil mixing with the faint scent of burning pine from my dying fire. And then a sound I'll never forget. The quietest of whispers, like someone breathing words I couldn't comprehend, coming from the edge of the light. It was too deliberate, too intimate, too human. It wasn't the forest making noises now, it was a person. And whoever it was, they were studying me, watching me with patience that was terrifying in its calmness. Every rational thought fled. Logic became a memory. The world narrowed to the triangle of light, shadow, and the unbroken, suffocating presence just beyond it. I slammed the van door, locked it, and pressed my back against the cold metal, sliding down until I sat on the ground. My legs shook uncontrollably. Every sense was heightened, the distant hoot of the owl now a harbinger, the whisper of leaves like communication, the faint rustle of undergrowth that could be the figure, could be my imagination. And yet deep down, I knew it wasn't imagination. I stayed there, huddled against the van, listening. The figure didn't reveal itself fully again, but the weight of its gaze pressed through the darkness, unrelenting. I realized with a clarity born of terror that I had stumbled into something I couldn't control, something that didn't adhere to the rules of daylight or rational thought. The forest was no longer a refuge. It was a cage. And the unseen figure, human-shaped, deliberate, patient, was the jailer. Minutes stretched like hours. I didn't know whether to call out, to confront, to flee. Every choice seemed wrong. Every hesitation seemed fatal. And through it all, the figure remained just at the edge, unseen but undeniable, a constant reminder that the night had turned against me, that solitude had become a trap, and that the line between the living and the shadows could bend in ways I had never imagined. By the time I dared to move again, my body had memorized panic. My mind had rehearsed every scenario, every escape, every misstep. I knew one thing with absolute certainty. Nothing in my experience, nothing in my years of camping had prepared me for this. The forest, the quiet, the tree line, it was all part of a game I hadn't agreed to play. And the watcher, the unseen, human-like figure, was the one writing the rules. I gripped the flashlight with both hands and considered my next move. The road was just beyond the clearing, just past the trees, but to reach it, I would have to step into the shadows, step toward the unknown, and I knew the figure would notice. That's when the panic peaked. The full weight of it, every instinct, every primal fear, every unspoken memory of being watched, hunted, exposed, crashed into me. My chest heaved, my stomach twisted, and my mind raced for answers that didn't exist. I was no longer a camper enjoying the solitude of Cades Cove. I was prey, and the forest, the very place I had loved, had become the instrument of terror. I pressed my back harder against the van, trying to slow my breathing, to make my presence as small and insignificant as possible. Every instinct screamed at me to bolt, to run into the road beyond the clearing, but I knew the moment I moved carelessly, that figure would see me. It wouldn't need to chase me. It would anticipate my steps, shadow my motion, let the darkness do the hunting for it. I could feel it, patient, calculating, a predator that existed on the edge of perception. I took a slow, deliberate breath, trying to quiet the hammering in my chest. The fire had finally died, leaving only the faint orange glow of embers swallowed quickly by the night. The tree line pressed closer, the trees themselves looming like silent sentinels, their branches creaking softly as though whispering secrets to one another. And through it all, I felt the figure's gaze like a tangible weight, a pressure that made the air feel thicker, heavier. I decided I had to move. Staying meant waiting to be discovered, and my mind refused to accept that outcome. I slid my hand into my pocket, fingers brushing against the cold metal of my flashlight. The van's door was my shield. The beam would be my weapon, or at least my only tool. Slowly, inch by inch, I lifted myself to my feet, eyes scanning the darkness, heart pounding so violently I could feel it in my throat. And then I saw it, just for a second, a shadow moving between the trees, impossibly fast but deliberate. Not fleeing, not hiding in panic, just moving with purpose, keeping pace with me without ever fully revealing itself. My stomach churned. It wasn't a trick of the light, not my imagination. It was there, watching, following, waiting. I forced myself to take another step, then another. The beam of my flashlight flicked across the ground, catching nothing but roots, leaves, and the occasional scurry of a night creature. And yet my senses screamed at me that this wasn't wildlife. Every rustle, every whisper of leaves carried intention. The figure was choosing how and when to reveal itself, teaching me, testing me. A branch cracked sharply to my left, and I jumped, my flashlight swinging wildly. The beam caught nothing, but my mind filled the gap. A movement in the periphery, darker than the darkness, and I swore I saw a flash of a human face, pale, brief, staring straight at me before melting back into the tree line. My pulse skyrocketed. My legs threatened to collapse, but I forced them to move, one step, then another, clinging to the van as if it were a lifeline. I could feel the sweat sliding down my back, cold against the warm night air. Every nerve ending felt raw, alive with the tension that coiled tighter with each heartbeat. I wanted to shout, to make noise, to scare whoever or whatever was out there. But the rational part of my brain whispered that any sound would betray me, would draw it closer. I was caught between terror and strategy, the forest both ally and enemy, every shadow a potential trap. Then I felt it, a shift in the darkness, just a footstep behind me. Soft, deliberate. Not quick, not hurried, but deliberate, measured, like someone playing a game of chess where I was the only piece on the board. My breath caught in my throat. My mind raced through every scenario. Confrontation, flight, hiding. None seemed viable. Every instinct screamed that exposure would be catastrophic. And yet, standing frozen wasn't safe either. I reached the van again, fumbling for the keys. My hands were shaking so violently I dropped them once, twice. The metal clanged against the running board, and I prayed the sound hadn't carried. When I finally got the door open, I slipped inside, slammed it shut, and locked it. The van became my refuge, the thin barrier between me and whatever stalked the clearing. I sat, pressed against the seat, trying to calm my shaking. The flashlight lay across my lap, beam swinging gently over the dashboard. Every instinct told me to start the engine and drive blindly through the darkness, but a deeper part of me hesitated. The figure had vanished, or at least wasn't visible, but I knew it hadn't left. I could feel it, a presence that refused to be ignored, lurking just beyond the glass. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. It was impossible to tell. The forest around me remained silent, deceptively so, as if holding its breath. Then I heard it again, a rustle, a movement across the clearing, subtle, almost imperceptible. My stomach clenched. I wasn't imagining it. Something or someone was out there, moving with intent, tracking me through the shadows. I turned the flashlight back on, sweeping the beam across the tree line. Nothing. And yet the unease didn't dissipate. My mind, in overdrive, filled the empty space with possibilities, each darker than the last. The figure could circle the van, could step into the shadows and wait for me to expose myself. I was trapped, confined, a lone human in a world that had shifted, where shadows were alive and the forest breathed with malice. I tried to be it was a camper, a lost hiker, a prankster seeking amusement. But deep down, I knew the truth. This wasn't ordinary. Not the timing, not the precision of movement, not the unrelenting pressure I felt from the edge of the tree line. There was intelligence here, a human-like mind orchestrating every shadow, every pause, every ripple in the darkness. I considered calling out, my voice breaking the tension like a knife. But the thought of speaking carried terror with it. Any sound might invite confrontation, provoke the figure into revealing itself. The forest had become a silent judge, and I was acutely aware that every choice carried consequences. Then a shadow shifted again, closer, deliberate, brushing the edge of the clearing. I could see nothing but the outline of a form, tall and human-shaped, moving with uncanny precision. My chest tightened, fear anchoring me to the seat. I gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white, and realized I had to make a choice. Wait and hope it left, or act and risk whatever waited in the darkness. The instinct to survive overrode everything else. I started the engine, the van roaring to life like a shout in the silent night. Headlights cut across the clearing, illuminating roots, branches, and for a heartbeat, just for a heartbeat, the figure. It froze, a dark shape against the trees, then vanished instantly, melting into shadow as if it had never been there. My stomach dropped. My pulse was a drumbeat of terror. The forest had claimed it again, erased it, leaving only the echo of fear behind. I didn't wait to see more. I shifted into gear and drove slowly toward the main road, headlights slicing through the tree line, ears straining for any sound. Every snapping branch, every rustle of leaves sent a spike of panic through me. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was following, watching, waiting for the right moment. By the time I reached the main road, the figure had not reappeared, but I knew it hadn't left. Something human-shaped, intelligent, and patient was out there, somewhere in the forest, and I would never forget the way it had observed me, tested me, and allowed panic to take root deep in my chest. I parked at a well-lit area near the ranger station, shaking, hands still trembling, mind reeling. The relief of human proximity was immediate, but the fear lingered, a shadow in the corners of my vision. Even as I told myself I was safe, part of me remained attuned to the forest, listening for movement, listening for that deliberate, human-like presence that had hunted me through the darkness. I sat there long after I should have calmed down, heart still racing, realizing that some places carried a memory, a consciousness that didn't disappear when the sun rose. Cades Cove had been a sanctuary for years, but that night it became a lesson. The forest can hide, shadows can think, and sometimes the watcher is human enough to terrify you in ways the wild never could. My name is Marcus, I'm 32, and I've spent more nights on asphalt and dirt than in my own bed. There's a rhythm to RV camping that I thought I understood. The hum of the engine, the clink of utensils against metal, the faint rustle of desert wind brushing against canvas and vinyl. But nothing had prepared me for the way the night can stretch its fingers into your mind, how it can press against your ribs and whisper until you question everything you thought you knew. It was March of 2022, early spring, when the desert is deceptive. During the day, the sun strikes the rock formations and the Joshua trees like fire, illuminating every jagged edge and casting shadows that seem to move with intention. At night, that same desert swallows sound and light, and the air becomes cold and dry. the kind that scrapes against your lungs and makes each breath feel deliberate, measured. I had arrived just as the last tourists were leaving the main campground, the lot thinning until I realized I might be the only one staying. I had chosen a remote spot near Skull Rock, the map indicating a small pullout with room for my van. The place was almost too perfect, the silence almost too complete. I set up camp, laid out my sleeping pad, and tried to distract myself with a book. But the desert has its own pulse, and even the hum of the engine, normally comforting, seemed suddenly hollow. That's when I heard it the first time, a faint whistling, carried on the wind. Not the casual whistle of someone hiking by, but a deliberate, sustained note, almost melodic, almost knowing. I stopped what I was doing. The wind shifted. The sound was gone. I laughed nervously at myself, telling myself it was the breeze moving through the skeletal branches of the Joshua trees. But there was a tightening in my chest, a prickle along my spine that told me this was no ordinary desert sound. By the time darkness fully settled, the shadows between the trees had deepened into shapes I could no longer comfortably identify. I'd made myself a simple dinner, canned chili and stale bread, and every rustle, every soft shift of sand against stone made my heart skip. I kept thinking I heard footsteps on the dirt path that led from the main road to my isolated pullout, but each time I looked, nothing was there. I told myself it was paranoia, the classic trap of being alone in the wild. Still, the whistling returned, now more insistent, seeming to circle the van like a predator measuring its prey. I wanted to convince myself to leave the door unlocked, to sit in the van with the lights dimmed, maybe even sleep without the comforting hum of the engine. But my instincts kept screaming that movement outside. Any attempt to confront this might invite whatever it was to approach. I tried reasoning. It could be coyotes, maybe a hiker who had lost their way, maybe the wind passing through a hollow rock. But no coyote whistles, no human whistles. And the wind? It doesn't circle a van with intent. Hours passed, or maybe minutes, time dissolved into that peculiar desert stillness, and the whistling grew sharper, more melodic, as if teasing me, coaxing me toward the door. My fingers shook slightly as I grabbed the flashlight, turning the beam outward, scanning the jagged shadows. Nothing. Just the trees. Just the rocks. Just the impossibly wide, empty darkness. And yet I could still hear it, the way it wound itself around my mind like smoke, curling in every corner, hiding in every hollow. Sleep was impossible. My thoughts, normally my refuge, became a prison. I imagined figures in the corners of my eyes, tall and distorted, half human, half shadow. Every time I turned my head, the whistling would pause and then resume, deliberately, mockingly, always just out of reach. I tried to convince myself to get back inside the van, to lock the doors, to turn the key in the ignition and let the hum of the engine fill the oppressive silence. But as soon as I did, it seemed to intensify, the sound traveling under the doors, around the wheels, wrapping the van in its eerie embrace. I realized then that my fear wasn't just of whoever, or whatever, was outside. It was the desert itself pressing against me, amplifying every heartbeat, every shallow breath, every flicker of imagination. My mind turned on itself, questioning the reality of the whistling, questioning my senses, questioning my decision to be there at all. And yet, even in this near paralysis, I knew running blindly into the dark desert wasn't an option. I had to find a way to survive the night. The hours stretched infinitely. My flashlight's batteries dimmed, the hum of the van seemed distant, and I felt the first sting of true panic when I realized the sound of the whistling now carried a rhythm I could almost anticipate. It wasn't random. It was waiting, watching, counting. My rational mind, the part of me that planned trips and checked weather reports, tried to assert itself. It whispered that if I stayed calm, if I waited until dawn, the sound would vanish like everything else in the desert. But the deeper, darker part of me knew that something was out there, testing me, probing for weakness. At some point, I made a choice I would later question for weeks. I opened the door. Not fully, just a sliver, just enough to peek out. The cold hit me instantly, dry and biting, scraping my skin like paper, and the desert was still, too still. Not a sound beyond the whistling, which had stopped, replaced by a tense, expectant silence. And then I saw it, barely discernible at first, the faint outline of movement between the Joshua trees, impossibly slow, deliberate, moving closer with each breath I took. My heart slammed against my chest. Every instinct screamed at me to retreat, to hide, to shut the door and pretend I'd never seen it. And yet I was frozen, caught between curiosity and fear, staring into the dark. The figure, or figures, never fully revealed themselves. Just hints, shapes, shadows bending against shadows, twisting in ways that no human body should. And then, almost casually, the whistling began again, low at first, then rising, now unmistakably human, yet distorted, warped by the night. It wasn't music. It was communication, and it was aimed at me. I felt an understanding, primal and terrifying, that this was not random. This was a warning. This was a challenge. I slammed the door shut and locked it, trembling, sweat mixed with the dry bite of desert dust on my skin. I kept the van running, lights dimmed, eyes darting between mirrors and windows, praying that dawn would come quickly. Hours dragged. The whistling faded but never fully disappeared. It became a background hum, a reminder that the desert does not forgive or forget. And when the first pale streaks of sunrise hit the rock formations, when the shadows shrank and the world seemed to right itself, I dared to step out, cautiously, scanning every inch of the campsite. Nothing, not a footprint, not a disturbance, just the wind, just the sun, just the silent, indifferent desert. That morning, I packed my van with a trembling hand, still feeling the echo of the whistling behind my ears, a sound that had burrowed into my bones. I left Joshua Tree with a quiet, unshakable understanding that some places are alive, not in the way we understand life, but in a deeper, older, more patient way. The desert had tested me, and I had survived, but I would never return without that awareness, without the respect it demanded. Even now, when I tell this story, the whistling creeps back into my memory. It isn't a sound I can describe fully. It's a feeling, a memory of fear that isn't quite fear, but something more profound. The realization that the world is bigger, stranger, and far less predictable than we allow ourselves to believe. I learned that night that camping is more than a weekend escape. It is a confrontation with nature, with the unknown, and most importantly, with oneself. And while the desert is beautiful, it is also patient, watching, remembering. And sometimes in the quiet, when you think you are alone, it will remind you of that fact with a sound that follows you long after you've left. I never thought a place like Yellowstone could make me feel truly alone, not just in the wilderness, but in my own skin. My name is Mark. I was 32 at the time, and I'd been RV camping across the West for years, chasing that elusive combination of freedom and solitude. Most days it was a dream. Morning coffee on a folding chair beside the RV, the soft hiss of steam from distant geysers, the smell of pine needles crushed underfoot. But that October, something in Yellowstone whispered differently. Something that I couldn't see at first, but that I felt crawling beneath the veneer of calm I always assumed the park offered. I had parked at a small, almost forgotten campground along the northern rim, where the trees clustered thickly and the usual chatter of tourists had thinned to nearly nothing. The air was crisp enough to make your lungs ache, and the shadows of the lodgepole pines stretched long across the frost-dusted ground. That night, I did what I usually did. I set up inside the RV, lit a few low lamps, and tried to read. The silence felt almost sacred. But it wasn't. Something was off, though I didn't know what yet. It began with a sound so subtle I almost convinced myself it was imagination, a soft scraping noise against the underside of the RV. I froze mid-page, listening. It stopped. My heart told me to check outside. Rational thought told me it was probably a raccoon or a stray deer. I hesitated, telling myself that the park's wildlife was harmless if you gave it space. But then it came again, a deliberate, almost measured shuffle, closer this time. Something that did not belong. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out into the cold, letting it sweep across the empty campsites. The beam hit nothing but fallen leaves and the glint of metal from my own RV. The shadows seemed deeper here, heavier, as if the night itself were pressing down. I shook my head and laughed nervously at my own jumpiness. Maybe I was just tired. Maybe solitude had made me paranoid. I told myself to go back inside, lock the door, and sleep. But the sound didn't go away. It had only paused, waiting for me to relax. By the time midnight came, the forest had changed entirely. The wind was a mere whisper through the pines, but it carried with it an unfamiliar cadence, like footsteps that shouldn't be there. I kept my flashlight on, scanning in slow, careful circles, but the more I watched, the more I felt the shape of something human-like, just beyond reach, just out of clarity. I could almost hear it breathing with the rhythm of the trees, crouched low, patient. Fear isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the silence between noises, the way shadows pause and then shift when you blink. That's what gripped me, deep in the marrow of my bones. I had always prided myself on being rational. I told myself again and again that someone wandering near a campsite at this hour was more likely lost than dangerous. But my instincts didn't listen to rationality. I remembered the stories I'd heard from other campers, the ones they shared late at night with a laugh that didn't reach their eyes, about people who disappeared while parked in otherwise safe spots. And suddenly, the thought of someone just watching, waiting for me to notice, was unbearable. Then came the movement I couldn't rationalize. I saw it at the corner of my eye, a figure, thin, hunched, slipping between trees like it was trying not to be noticed. My chest tightened so quickly I felt like I might suffocate. I turned the flashlight sharply in its direction, and it vanished as though it had never existed. I wanted to call out to demand whoever, or whatever it was, show itself. But my voice caught in my throat. Every instinct screamed to retreat inside, lock the doors, and pretend I didn't see it. But pretending wouldn't stop it from being there. I spent what felt like hours lying awake, straining to hear any sound. My mind tried to fill in the gaps with reason, but the forest refused to cooperate. Each rustle, each distant snap of a branch sounded deliberate. Each time I thought I heard footsteps on the gravel of the campsite, I froze. I felt observed, studied, as though my very movements were being catalogued. Fear had become a physical weight pressing against my ribs, and I couldn't shake the sense that leaving the lights on or stepping outside was just an invitation to a predator who had already learned the rules. Somewhere in the darkness, I imagined eyes watching. Not animal eyes, not reflective and instinctive, human-like, intentional. That thought made my stomach twist, made the cold sweat stick to my back. I wanted to convince myself I was imagining things, that the night was playing tricks. But I knew better. My mind doesn't always lie to me when fear takes root. I realized then that the first step of real terror isn't a scream or a shadow. It's certainty. The certainty that someone is there and you can't make them leave. I can't explain why I didn't leave. Part of me wanted to run into the night, to break free from whatever unseen watcher had taken an interest in me. Another part, a more foolish, stubborn part, was determined not to let fear win. I stayed put, clinging to the safety of my RV walls, listening, imagining, fearing. I had packed a small knife for emergencies, a flashlight, and my wits. But as the night stretched on, none of it felt sufficient. Around 3 a.m, the noise began again, only this time it wasn't scraping. It was deliberate, methodical, knocks against the metal frame of the RV, slow, patient, punctuated by silence. I counted each one, and in the intervals, I tried to locate the source. Nothing. Only the trees swaying in the dim light, only my breath, shallow and rapid. And then the unmistakable sound of someone or something running a hand along the side of the vehicle, from front to back. It was human enough to recognize, wrong enough to terrify. I grabbed my flashlight and flung the door open, shining the beam into the shadows. Nothing moved, nothing stirred except the leaves. My voice shook as I called out, "Who's there?" There was no answer, just the night. But I felt it, still watching, crouched at the edge of visibility, patient, waiting for the moment I let my guard down. I realized then that I had been living under the illusion of solitude my whole trip, that solitude is a gift when the world is benign, but it is a cage when malevolent eyes are watching from the dark. Hours passed like this. Sleep refused me. I imagined the figure circling, slipping silently, learning my routines. I began to see movement where there was none, to hear patterns in the random sounds of nature. My mind became a trap of its own, and yet, paradoxically, hyper-aware of what was outside, what was breathing and moving with human intent. The forest was no longer my sanctuary. It was a theater of terror, and I had an uninvited lead actor. By dawn, when the first weak rays of sunlight pierced the canopy, I made a decision. I packed with deliberate care, silent as I could manage, and started the RV. Every sound, every crack of a branch under my tires, every flutter of birds in the distance, felt like it might betray me. I didn't glance at the trees. I didn't check behind me. I drove until the campground was behind me, until the sense of eyes on me dissolved into the haze of morning. And even then, as I parked at a more populated area, the image of that figure, human-like, patient, waiting, stayed with me. I never discovered who or what it was. I've returned to Yellowstone many times since, always cautious, always aware. I've learned the hard way that the wilderness is not only wild in the natural sense, it is wild in the human sense too, full of unseen people, of intentions you can't predict, of patience that outlasts your bravery. And sometimes the most terrifying creatures aren't those you can see. They are those who choose to watch, to study, to let fear grow inside you before you ever glimpse their face. I remember the first time I realized that the forest could feel alive in a way that wasn't comforting. My name is Lucas. I'm 34, and I've been RV camping up and down the West Coast for most of my adult life. I've always preferred the quiet, the solitude, but I rarely travel alone. That summer of 2021, my friend Adrian and I decided to make a trip out of it. Nothing elaborate, just a few days at Crater Lake in Oregon, a place I'd visited before, but never under the thick heat of July. The lake was striking that year, unnaturally still, a mirror reflecting the jagged cliffs that rose above it like silent sentinels. The air had a faint sweetness to it, pine and dry grass mingling with something else I couldn't name at the time. It was a subtle hint, the kind that creeps into your memory later once fear has settled its roots. We arrived late afternoon, the sun dipping behind the rims, burning the sky gold and magenta. The campground was quieter than I expected. Most of the spots were empty, a few RVs scattered, their owners lounging or preparing dinners. There was a hum of conversation somewhere, but it felt distant, like sound coming from underwater. We picked a spot near the edge of the forest, close enough to the lake that the scent of cold water carried to us when the wind shifted. Our plan was simple: set up, relax, maybe hike a little before nightfall, nothing fancy. By the time we were done with the RV, I noticed a neighbor across the small gravel clearing. He was in his mid-40s, wearing a baseball cap low over his eyes, sitting on a folding chair and staring into the trees. At first glance, he seemed harmless. I nodded politely as we unpacked. He nodded back, a brief, almost robotic gesture. There was something faintly off about it, but I dismissed it. He didn't speak to anyone else, just watched. I remember Adrian whispering, jokingly, that he looked like he was guarding something, and I laughed along, though I couldn't shake the vague unease curling in my stomach. The evening passed in the usual way, a warm meal cooked over our RV stove, a short walk down to the water's edge. The lake was mesmerizing. I could hear the faint lap of water against the rocks, the occasional bird cry echoing from the cliffs above. Adrian was telling a story about a camping trip gone wrong in Yosemite, his voice full of humor, but my mind kept drifting. The neighbor's presence lingered, the way he shifted in his chair whenever we glanced toward him, always seeming to stare just beyond us. There was no immediate threat, but something about that stillness pressed down on me, subtle, almost imperceptible. Night came quickly. We had only a few lanterns, and the shadows they cast seemed eager to stretch themselves along the forest floor. The trees, dense and heavy, swayed faintly in the warm breeze, branches scraping against one another like fingernails over skin. I found it impossible to sleep at first, my thoughts drawn to the neighbor. Every so often, I'd glance through the RV window, expecting him to have vanished, but he was always there, still staring, still impossibly silent. Adrian tried to tease me out of it, insisting I was imagining things, but I could feel the tension building, knotting around my chest. Around midnight, I woke to a faint rustle outside. Not the usual night sounds, the distant call of an owl or the shuffle of leaves, but deliberate, like someone stepping carefully through dry pine needles. I nudged Adrian awake. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. He grumbled, reaching for his phone, muttering about raccoons or deer, but the sound didn't stop. In fact, it seemed to move, circling our RV slowly, deliberately. I pressed my forehead against the window, straining to see in the dim light cast by the small lamps. And then I saw him, the neighbor, standing at the edge of the forest, motionless, watching us. Only now he was closer, much closer. Adrian froze beside me. That's not possible," he said quietly. His voice trembled just slightly, though he was trying not to let it show. I didn't answer. My stomach dropped as I realized the rustling was accompanied by something else. A soft, almost imperceptible scraping against the side of our RV. Whoever or whatever was out there wasn't making normal movements. It was slow, deliberate, probing, like someone trying to see if we were awake. I grabbed the flashlight from the counter and shone it toward the edge of the trees. For a moment, there was nothing. Then I caught a glimpse of him, or something shaped like him, ducking between the pines. I could see the outline of the cap, the angle of the head, and the way he moved. Not quite human, not entirely natural. My mind raced. I wanted to call out, to ask what he was doing, to break the tension with sound. But the thought of making any noise felt dangerous, like the wrong word could trigger something I wasn't prepared for. We stayed that way for what felt like hours, listening to the subtle shifts in the night around us. The scraping returned, softer this time, coming from a different angle. I swear I could hear a breath, shallow, uneven, almost synchronized with mine. It wasn't until the faint light of dawn began to push through the trees that I finally felt able to move. Adrian and I crept outside, hearts hammering, scanning the clearing. The neighbor was gone. Not a chair overturned, not a trace of him. Only the faint indentation in the gravel where his chair had been, almost mocking in its stillness. We tried to rationalize it, of course. Maybe he had packed up and left during the night, or maybe it had been an illusion born of nerves. But deep down, we both knew there was more to it. The campground felt heavier that morning, like the shadows themselves had weight. The locals we spoke to when we went into the small visitor center all gave vague, uneasy glances at each other when we mentioned the man. One woman finally murmured, "Oh, you mean the guy who vanishes sometimes?" Happens more than people think. We pressed for details, but they only shook their heads. He wasn't listed on any registry, any permit, any record. He came and went at odd times, appearing in campsites that were technically empty, never interacting except with subtle, deliberate gestures. It was as if he existed only to be seen, a ghost threading through the trees. A reminder that the forest wasn't trees and water. It was a place that could remember you, that could watch you. That night, I hardly slept. Every noise, the wind brushing against the RV, the distant splash of the lake, the creak of our own door, felt magnified, deliberate. I found myself sitting at the window, flashlight in hand, staring at the edge of the forest. And then, briefly, I thought I saw him again. Just a shadow, moving with impossible patience, disappearing when I blinked. Adrian refused to admit it, but I could see the tension in his jaw, the way he flinched at every rustle. We spent the next day cautiously, avoiding wandering too far from the RV, trying to stick to visible trails, trying to convince ourselves it was nothing more than coincidence. But every time we turned a corner or glanced over a ridge, there was that same prickle at the back of our necks. a feeling that we were being cataloged, assessed, noted, and perhaps even judged by something we could neither name nor confront directly. It wasn't until our last night that the full weight of it hit me. We had gone to bed early, exhausted from hiking and the tension that had built steadily over the past 2 days. I drifted into a light sleep, the kind where your mind lingers between dreams and reality. And then I heard it. A soft knock at the RV door, 3 distinct taps, deliberate enough to pierce through any rational explanation. My heart slammed. Adrian stirred beside me. I whispered, Don't move," even though he hadn't yet. The knocks continued, a rhythm impossible to ignore. I held my breath, convinced that if I spoke, if I looked, we would find the impossible standing there. When we finally dared to open the door, there was nothing. No one. Just the faint indentation of a boot in the dirt, barely visible in the dim light, and the forest pressing in around us like it had a pulse of its own. It wasn't until we left Crater Lake that I understood the lesson embedded in that fear. The forest, the quiet neighbors, the unseen observer, they weren't just threats. They were reminders. They were warnings to respect your instincts, to pay attention to the subtle cues, to understand that not every danger is immediate, and not every horror announces itself with a scream. Some horrors exist in the slow, deliberate erosion of certainty, in the quiet proof that the world contains things you cannot control, cannot explain, cannot outrun. Adrian and I never saw the neighbor again, though the memory of him, the slow patience, the silent observation, the unnamable presence, lingered long after we returned to our normal lives. Every time I camp now, every time I hear a soft scrape against the RV or a shadow shift in the corner of my vision, I remember that man. Not as a specter to fear in a fantastical sense, but as a teacher of vigilance, of awareness, of the thin line between comfort and dread in the wilderness. Even today, months later, I replay that week in my mind in minute detail. I relive the stretches of night where the forest seemed to lean toward us, listening, noting, waiting. And I realize that some of the lessons you learn in nature aren't about surviving bears or storms or treacherous cliffs. Sometimes it's about surviving the unseen, surviving the presence that defies explanation, surviving yourself. Because in the end, the forest isn't just trees. The lake isn't just water. And the neighbor, you don't just see him, you feel him in that silent, patient way that lingers long after the eyes have closed and the RV has rolled away. And I would be lying if I said I wasn't grateful for it, because it taught me more about fear, more about instinct, and more about respect than any trail, any storm, any hike ever could.